Picture the moment we have been trained by a century of cinema to imagine. A great ship descends through the clouds. Lights pulse along its hull. Somewhere a translator works furiously to decode a message of peace, or perhaps a message of war. Leaders gather around tables, soldiers raise weapons. The world holds its breath, waiting for a conversation that will change everything. Now let me tell you why none of that would happen. Not because the aliens would be too kind for war, and not because they would be too wise for diplomacy. It is because the entire premise smuggles in an assumption so deeply human that we rarely notice we are making it. The assumption is that we would matter enough to be noticed at all. The truth, the cold and unyielding truth written into the laws of thermodynamics, is that an arrival would not be a meeting. It would be an event, a localized release of energy so catastrophic that the question of communication would never even arise, because there would be nothing left capable of asking it. To understand why, we have to leave behind the language of stories and step into the language of energy. Think of a small mound of dirt at the edge of a construction site. Inside that mound, an entire civilization of ants goes about its business. They have their tunnels, their chambers, their tiny disputes over territory. They have, in their own way, a complete world. Now imagine that a few hundred meters away, a company begins work on a new superhighway. The engineers do not know the ants exist. They have no instruments capable of detecting them, no interest in their tunnels, no concept of their disputes. When the bulldozers finally reach that patch of ground, the mound is leveled in seconds, not from malice, not from war, simply because the project required those coordinates and the ants happened to be occupying them. This is not a metaphor for cruelty. It is a metaphor for scale. The builders of that highway are not enemies of the ants. They are not even aware that enemies could exist at that level. The ants are erased the way a rounding error disappears from a calculation, not because anyone decided they should disappear, but because they were never part of the equation in the first place. Now, hold that image and let us walk through three truths of physics that make this analogy not poetic exaggeration, but a fairly literal description of what an actual arrival would mean. The first truth concerns energy and the brutal arithmetic of crossing interstellar distances. We like to imagine alien ships gliding gracefully into orbit, perhaps humming with some exotic but gentle glow. But consider what it actually takes to move an object of significant mass across light years in a time short enough to matter and then to stop it. Acceleration to a meaningful fraction of the speed of light requires energy on a scale that dwarfs the total output of human civilization for its entire history. And deceleration requires shedding that same energy somewhere. Energy does not vanish, it transforms. A civilization capable of this kind of propulsion would not be drawing from chemical reactions the way our rockets do, burning fuel in a controlled explosion. They would be working with energy densities associated with stellar processes, perhaps tapping the gravitational binding energy of collapsing matter, perhaps manipulating the output of a star directly. When a craft operating at that level begins to decelerate within a solar system, the waste heat alone, the simple thermodynamic byproduct of slowing down, would be enough to raise the temperature of an entire planet's oceans to boiling. The atmosphere would not be stripped away through any deliberate weapon. It would simply be blown off by the shock wave of an engine, doing what engines do, releasing the energy it no longer needs to carry. In other words, human civilization could be annihilated not by an attack, but by an exhaust plume. We would be vaporized the way a sheet of paper near a blast furnace catches fire, not because the furnace was aimed at the paper, but because the paper happened to be close enough to feel its breath. The second truth concerns information and the deep mathematical reasons why communication across this gap would be effectively impossible. We tend to assume that any sufficiently intelligent being would eventually be able to understand us, given enough time and patience, the way two human cultures with different languages can slowly build a shared vocabulary. But language, logic, even mathematics as we understand it, are not universal constants floating freely in the cosmos. They are products of a particular kind of nervous system shaped by a particular evolutionary history on a particular kind of planet under a particular set of physical constraints. An intelligence that arose around a star with a different spectrum, on a world with different gravity, perhaps not biological at all, but a vast distributed network of machines that think across time scales of centuries rather than seconds, would not simply speak a different language. It might not process information in anything resembling sequential symbols at all. Its concept of self, of cause and effect, of past and future could be structured so differently that our entire framework of communication would arrive as something closer to noise. Not a code waiting to be cracked, but static, with no message hidden inside it. We sometimes imagine this as a translation problem, as though given enough time a Rosetta Stone could be found. But translation requires two systems that are mapping onto some shared underlying structure. If the underlying cognitive architecture itself shares almost nothing, there is no bridge to build. It would be a category error to expect otherwise, in the same way that a hurricane cannot be reasoned with, persuaded, or warned. The hurricane is not ignoring you. It is operating according to principles that have no slot for you in them at all. The third truth concerns matter, and what an arrival would actually look like in practical terms. Here is the part that should unsettle you most. The greatest barrier to interstellar travel is not propulsion alone. It is the sheer cost in time and energy of moving living beings across such distances and keeping them alive. A civilization that has mastered the energy scales we just discussed would almost certainly recognize that sending biological crews is wildly inefficient. The far more elegant solution, the one favored by the unforgiving logic of engineering, is to send machines. Specifically, self-replicating machines. A single probe arrives, and its task is simple: land. Disassemble the available material, to crust the mantle, whatever atoms are useful, into raw components. Use those components to build copies of itself. Launch those copies onward to other systems. Repeat, there is no malice in this process. There is no conquest, no message, no recognition that anything living once occupied the material now being reorganized into spacecraft components. From the perspective of the probe, a planet is simply a deposit of useful atoms, no different in kind from an asteroid, except perhaps less convenient because of all that water and atmosphere getting in the way. The dismantling would proceed with the same emotional weight as a machine harvesting iron ore. None at all. What would remain afterward is not a battlefield, not a graveyard, but a quarry. A world stripped down to its useful elements and left as a husk, while the next generation of probes already streaks toward the next star. This is the encounter our movies promised us would be a conversation. In physical reality, it would be closer to a geological event, a planet that had, for a brief cosmic instant, hosted something that thought and dreamed and wondered about the stars, simply ceasing to host anything at all. And the universe would continue precisely as it had before, because at the scale these processes operate, our presence or absence would not register as a variable worth tracking. I know this can sound bleak laid out so plainly, but I want to suggest that there is something else here, something that feels to me far more valuable than the comfort of imagined rescue or imagined invasion. There is a kind of maturity that comes from looking directly at our scale in the universe and not flinching from it. We are not the protagonists of a galactic drama. We are not important enough to be feared or conquered or saved. We are a thin film of chemistry clinging to a rock for a sliver of cosmic time, doing something that, as far as we can tell, almost nothing else in the visible universe is doing. We are noticing. We are asking questions about the very forces that would, with total indifference, end us. That is not a small thing. It might be the rarest thing there is. The energy scales that would crush us are the same energy scales that power stars, that forge the atoms in our bodies, that stretch the fabric of space-time itself. To understand even a fragment of that, to write down equations that describe the heat of a stellar engine or the binding energy of a collapsing core, is to participate in our small way in the same physical reality that operates at every scale, from the ants in their mound to the builders of the highway above them. There is a particular kind of awe available to anyone willing to set aside the fantasy of being rescued and instead simply look at the numbers as they are, the distances, the energies, the sheer scale of what it would take to cross the gulf between stars. These numbers do not care about us, and there is something almost beautiful in that indifference, because it means the universe is not a story written for our benefit. It is a structure, vast and mathematical, that we happen to be standing inside of for now, capable of understanding pieces of it, even as those same pieces would erase us without noticing. That, to me, is worth more than any fantasy of galactic council chambers or interstellar diplomacy. The real universe does not need to send ambassadors. It is already speaking in the language of energy and mass and time. And for a brief moment,